the basically January to June session of Parliament. This report is on the fall session, but it was truncated by Stephen Harper's proroguing. So when I normally would have been back in Parliament by the second week of September. Instead, it was mid-October, and I used the time when I suddenly had some empty weekdays. All my weekends were all spoken for work, but there were some weekdays suddenly open. So I just went on a cross-country town hall tour on democracy, because I've just been doing town halls here. It seemed like the thing to do. And we put together in very short order 17 town hall meetings in 8 provinces and the Yukon. And it was tremendous and really fun and interesting to talk what was wrong with Canadian democracy. Basically the themes that you got in the last Householder that I mailed to everybody. So when the House began, the Wednesday after Thanksgiving, there was the speech from the throne. The only really newsworthy thing out of the speech from the throne was the news that Stephen Harper said that Canada had achieved an agreement in principle with the European Union for the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, known as CETA. We still haven't seen a text for it, but there has been more negotiation subsequently. So and I don't know what their process for passing it will be. They haven't told us if they plan to put it to a vote of the House of Commons, or do what they tried to do with the Canada-China Investment Treaty and leave it for the Cabinet to approve. Fortunately, the Canada-China Investment Treaty remains unratified, at least to this day. The other thing that happened right after I got back to Parliament was that the Conservatives went to great lengths to limit my rights. So in a lot of ways, it's a backhanded compliment, but compliment it is to have a majority party with the majority of the seats in the House, if not the majority of public support, going to great lengths to curtail my rights to put forward amendments at report stage. So although this is sort of parliamentary process minutiae, you probably remember that I've been bringing forward a lot of amendments before Parliament as a whole for votes, and that managed to make quite a dent in process when I put forward 400 amendments to Bill C-38, the Spring 2012 Omnibus Budget Bill. And the reason I had the right to do that is, and that other MPs didn't have the same rights, is that, and I was the first MP to notice this particular rule and use it. So, and it's always the case that majority parties will try to shut down minority parties. It's just the first time that a majority party's gone after one MP. But the history of this ability that I had at report stage stems actually from the Reform Party trying to use the process, actually it was Alliance by then, using the process at report stage when bills are through committees, it's come back before the House, it's the penultimate vote before a bill is passed and goes to the Senate, and the Alliance Party tried to stop the Niska Treaty by bringing forward 700 amendments at report stage, and the response from the majority Liberals, it took them 2 years, but they said, look, you can't be doing that. You had a right in committee to bring forward amendments. So you can't put forward, in this case the Alliance amendments were largely trivial, things like changing a semicolon to a comma. But anyway, they did as many as they could to try to monkey wrench the process. So they changed the rules and said, look, if you've been sitting on a committee, you don't have the right to come forward at report stage and try to put forward amendments. And I realized when I first got elected, I thought, well, yo-ho, this is a new rule. It wasn't in effect when I last worked in Parliament. It came in 2002. But this gives me the right, because I can't sit on committees. Any member of Parliament in a party with fewer than 12 MPs doesn't sit on committee. So I've been using the rights that I have at report stage to bring forward all these amendments. And the rationale being, I'm not on committee. So they cleverly, right after the speech from the throne, in every first meeting of every parliamentary committee, simultaneously, Conservative members of those committees brought forward motions that were identical. So the fiction is that somehow each of these MPs came up with the same motion. But the effect was to say that 48 hours before they got to clause by clause on any bill, members of Parliament in parties of fewer than 12, or independent MPs, in other words, the whole group of people to whom this rule applies, will be invited to submit amendments before the committee. They will be deemed to have been moved, even though people in my position can't move members of the committee, and that I would be allowed to speak to my amendments. Well, they allowed me to speak to my amendments for 60 seconds per amendment, and then they get defeated. So the effect of this, and we did put up a fight. The NDP was helpful, the Liberals too, eventually, to try to say that this is not an invitation that assists in creating more democracy in Parliament. This restricts democracy in Parliament. This takes away rights from people who have very few rights when you're in a party with fewer than 12 seats. So far they've gotten away with it. It does increase my workload. It means basically run from committee to committee as they get to clause by clause with my amendments. I still try to put forward amendments at report stage. I'm allowed to try. They're usually ruled out of order by the speaker unless they're mere deletions. So I'll keep trying it, but it really has been one of the, it certainly was a major event of the fall because I had to fight it and then start living with it, you know, getting a notice 48 hours away from clause by clause, where are your amendments for this committee? So it's put quite a lot of stress on my staff. We also, I did negotiate in June when they were trying to adjourn a few days early for the summer. I wouldn't accept unanimous consent to adjourn unless, and what I ended up doing, not to give you the full thing, but we ended up as a compromise with every MP in my situation again, so all the bloc MPs and me and a number of independents would have the right to share one seat on a committee studying something called the Board of Internal Economy, which is the sort of star chamber, completely non-transparent group of MPs who decide what MPs can claim as expenses, how much transparency there is around expenses, how the House of Commons is run, how our labor relations, which are frankly dreadful towards staff on Parliament Hill, such things as the rules. As an MP, I can claim almost anything for reimbursement. There are categories of things I just don't put in for because it seems ridiculous. The one category of thing that I'd like to put in for and is not allowed is carbon offsets for travel. So as far as I know, I'm the only MP buying carbon offsets for travel. So anyway, the Board of Internal Economy was being studied by the committee, and it's kind of interesting. It ended up being sort of, I was coordinating for the bloc, and we negotiated among the bloc and a wonderful MP who has left the Conservative caucus to sit as an independent named Brett Rathgaber. Brett and I have an equally firm resolve that Canada needs to be a real democracy again, which means dismantling PMO. I've never really pressed him on what he thinks about climate policy or anything else, but we agree on many things. So Brett Rathgaber, Maria Morani, who'd been thrown out of the bloc, Bruce Hire, who left the NDP and was at that point sitting as an independent, probably heard since he decided to become a Green, but negotiating among all those different groups for a shared dissent. It's a really interesting process. So it feels like these little efforts are improving democracy. The most exciting thing for democracy in the last session of Parliament was Michael Chong's private member's bill. He's a Conservative member of Parliament for a riding outside of Toronto called Wellington Halton Hills. It's really a very agricultural area. He grew up on a farm there. He is wonderful. I got a lot of people tweeting and saying, well, it can't be a good bill if a Conservative put it forward. I'm saying, no, wait. This is a great guy. He's also the Conservative who sits on the All-Party Climate Caucus at Fort Canada. So we work together quite a lot. His bill calls for the removal of the requirement under the Elections Act for the leader's signature on nomination forms. So it would remove the threat value that every leader of every party, except the Greens, because we've removed it through our bylaws. But all the other leaders of parties can say, if you don't do what I say, you won't run again. I'll throw you out of caucus. So he also created in his bill rules for how someone can be expelled from caucus. No longer solely a unilateral power of a leader. And he's created a process by which a caucus in the Canadian Parliament can do what caucuses can do in all the other Westminster parliamentary democracies. At least in Canada's, under Michael Chong's bill, they'd be allowed to start a leadership review. To say in the UK or in Australia, they can actually do the whole thing, and they can depose a sitting prime minister, as the Conservatives did in the UK when they got rid of Margaret Thatcher, and in Australia recently, kind of a revolving door. So Michael Chong's bill restores parliamentary tradition that the caucus of elected members of a party would have the ability to at least start a leadership review, and then it would be the members of the party convention who choose a new leader. So it's a really healthy blow for democracy, and he's got a lot of support. As far as other legislation, the biggest piece of legislation we dealt with this fall was Bill C-4, which was the second half of the omnibus bills of the 2013 budget. So another 400-page bill, with many laws changed, but the laws that were most hurt by C4 really related to labor relations, and particularly collective bargaining for people in the civil service, and the right under the Federal Labor Code to refuse dangerous work. Danger was redefined. They also included some measures, retroactively trying to fix the act for appointing a judge to the Supreme Court from Quebec, because they hadn't actually followed the letter of the law in appointing Marc Nadon. That case is still before the Supreme Court. There were a lot of quite disparate parts to this omnibus bill. By the way, the omnibus bill followed through on Budget 2013's commitment to get rid of the Canadian International Development Agency. So CEDA has been completely folded into Foreign Affairs. It's no longer a separate agency. It also dealt with changing a number of very old laws. Actually, the Crow's Nest Pass Act had to be amended in order to allow Harper to sell off a big chunk of land in southeastern British Columbia. Now, you've probably seen in the press that to get out of deficit, they're basically sort of holding a fire sale on Canadian assets, selling off rare Canadian coins, selling off the Canada House in the heart of London. So those asset sales don't have to come before the House of Commons. But this land called the Dominion Coal Lands, which was, I think it was 40,000 hectares. I'm trying to remember exactly how much it was. It was on the tens of thousands of hectares. And it had become federal land in the negotiations for building the railway. So that's what's the Crow's Nest Pass Act. So we had to amend that to allow this land to be sold. It's in a very important ecological zone, part of Waterton, very near Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, and had been proposed for national park status, and it's being sold for coal mining.
Great.
And that didn't, and the thing about an omnibus bill is when there's so much stuff in one bill, all these pieces don't get talked about at all. The other thing that happened to me this fall that I should mention, there was a number of bills. I can tell you what happened with the Cluster Munitions Act, with the First Nations Elections Act. I did amendments to all of those, and a copyright bill. But I also, when I was talking to Michael earlier, I got myself to the climate negotiations in Warsaw in Poland. If you follow climate at all in terms of international negotiations, you'll know that the long, dreadfully protracted, and not particularly effective, got to say, global negotiating process for a workable climate treaty goes into its international full session every, basically late November, mid to late November, and it's always called the Conference of the Parties. This was COP19, took place in Warsaw, Poland, and I was the only member of parliament to go, other than Leona Gluckach, who's the Minister of Environment. So it was a very interesting experience. I went with the intention of, because I tried to connect with, I'd once gone to Durban at COP17. I went as a member of the delegation of Papua New Guinea, so that I could get in the rooms and work, because if you're wearing a pink badge, it means you're with a country, a nation, a party to the convention, and therefore you can get in all the rooms where the negotiations are happening. If you go as a non-government organization observer, which is how I would have to go if I didn't have a country, I'd be going as part of the Global Greens Network. And you can get in the plenary, and you can go to side events, but you really can't work the key negotiations. So a slight mistake on my part, I suppose, personally, was that before I left for Warsaw, having failed to find a country that wanted me to help them on their delegation, I saw the very moving opening statement by the lead negotiator for the Philippines, who after the typhoon said, this is climate change, we have to stop this damage, it's criminal, and I will fast, he said, Yeb Sanyo. I will fast until these negotiations are over to add to the urgency. So as I did my press before leaving Ottawa, I said, well, I'll fast in solidarity with Yeb Sanyo. So I got to Warsaw, and I'm fasting in solidarity with Yeb Sanyo, and suddenly, because I figured I wasn't going to be working that hard, because it'd be really hard to work when you only have the credentials of an NGO. You can't get in all the back rooms and work once the door's closed and they're negotiating until 3 in the morning. There's no point sitting outside the door. So once I got there and I got my credentials as an observer, I was approached by the head of the Afghanistan delegation. So So I ended up being on the Afghanistan delegation because they needed help. Now, so it was a bit grueling, fasting and working the 24-hour kind of cycles that I was doing. So anyway, but Warsaw did not make the kind of progress it should have. The deadline for a new climate treaty is 2015 at what will be COP21 in Paris. And as everybody else is watching the Hollande news from France about his various affairs, all I'm thinking about is what will this mean for the Paris climate negotiations? Because the coalition government that Hollande is running is actually very committed to getting a good climate agreement out of Paris. Anyway, 2015 in Paris is a deadline, so I'm trying to re-engage the climate movement and networks into getting re-engaged, because people disengaged because they were so depressed after Copenhagen, and they haven't gotten re-engaged yet. So I left COP19 in Warsaw. We had about another week back in Parliament. We had early adjournment, and I agreed to have early adjournment because at that point all the bills that would have been passed before Christmas were awful, so why not have early adjournment? I didn't negotiate any special well, like getting on the committee to look at the Board of Internal Economy the way I did in June. And I should have wondered, why do they want early adjournment? Because the very next day was when Canada Post announced the ending of residential delivery of mail in urban centres and massive laying off of people. The other thing that happened after adjournment, of course, of note, was the National Energy Board decision for the Joint Review Panel with its conditions, but saying the conditional support for the Enbridge project. So that's kind of, I think that covers my key things that happened since we last were here for a discussion. There's always other things off to the side and to the margins and things that I should be working on more. I can share with you now that, because it's come up at every town hall meeting, is something else that came to light since adjournment, which is the closing of the libraries, the DFO libraries. I'd already protested the closing of a number of forest libraries across Canada, but these DFO library closures have gotten a lot more attention. And I've been doing the legal research, and I'm double checking it. I know that since Craig is don't put this part on air yet, because I've got to double check it, but I think that what they did was illegal. I've just been doing research about the Library and Archives Act for the Parliament of Canada. And any repository of information that is the property of the Government of Canada is the property of the people of Canada, and you can't destroy any archived or library materials without the written authorization of somebody called the Librarian and Archivist of Canada, who's appointed through Governor and Council appointment. Now, it may be that they put someone in place who's just saying, sure, destroy everything. So I have to find out if the acting, because they currently don't have a fully appointed library archivist for Canada. When I'm calling him tomorrow morning to ask if I can see all the letters for the approval of the destruction of these materials, because, and he, under the law, this person is supposed to actually review them and make sure they're not essential for Canada. They're actually duplicative or extraneous or unnecessary. So that will be I think the first question I ask in question period. We'll be back in Parliament. My first question is Monday, January 27th, so less than a week from now. So I'm hoping to get my ducks lined up in terms of how, if I can prove it's illegal before Monday. Anyway, so that's enough for me. And we've got logs.
Yes, I'm going to stick another one on.